Observe the national debt indicator in Times Square presently, and you'll witness a figure that ought to alarm every citizen of this nation. It's rapidly surpassing $36 trillion and is on course to hit $40 trillion at an unprecedented velocity. To offer some context, imagine stacking $1 bills equivalent to $36 trillion. The edifice would extend beyond the moon and stretch for millions of miles into the void. However, here's the crucial information they're omitting. This isn't merely a colossal number displayed on a screen. It's not simply an abstract concern for future generations. This represents a financial instrument aimed directly at your personal finances, your retirement security, and the prospects of your offspring. Within the ensuing 18 minutes, I will meticulously unveil the strategy the United States government intends to employ to make this debt vanish. Furthermore, I will demonstrate through mathematical principles and historical parallels that you are the party who will bear the ultimate cost. This will not manifest through taxation or expenditure reductions, but rather through the insidious erosion of your purchasing capacity. Something fundamentally altered in the year 2024, shattering a 247-year precedent in the annals of American fiscal history. For the very first instance, the United States government is now allocating more funds towards servicing the interest on its debt than it is dedicating to national defense. Let that realization truly settle in. We are investing more to compensate bondholders from prior eras than we are to equip the military that safeguards us in the present. Our expenditure on interest exceeds our outlay for the entire Medicaid program, which provides healthcare to 90 million Americans. We are spending more on interest than we allocate to all federal educational initiatives, all transportation infrastructure projects, and all scientific research endeavors combined. The annual interest obligation alone has just surpassed $1.1 trillion. That equates to $3 billion each day. That amounts to $125 million every hour. That translates to $35,000 every single second, continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, solely to manage existing debt, and this figure is on an upward trajectory. This is no longer a partisan issue. It is not a conflict between Democrats and Republicans. It is not a division between the left and the right. This has evolved into a mathematical predicament from which no degree of political resolve can offer an escape. And there are precisely 3 avenues for resolution. Every nation that has ever amassed such a substantial debt relative to its economic output has confronted the identical trio of choices. History has rigorously evaluated these options repeatedly across centuries and continents, and 2 of them are currently deemed politically unfeasible in America. Option 1. Austerity. This entails drastic, debilitating spending cuts and severe tax escalations to genuinely balance the budget presently and commence debt reduction. We would need to either instantly double everyone's income taxes or completely disband the entire United States military, or implement a 40% reduction in Social Security and Medicare benefits, or a combination of all 3 that would be catastrophic. Allow me to present the precise figures. The federal government currently expends approximately $6.8 trillion annually and collects around $4.9 trillion in revenue. This results in a deficit of $1.9 trillion. And this calculation does not even account for compounding interest. To bridge this disparity solely through taxation, you would need to increase every American's tax burden by approximately 40%. Option 2. Default. The government could simply make a public declaration stating __quote_0__, Russia engaged in this in 1998. Argentina did so in 2001 and again in 2014 and once more in 2020. Greece narrowly averted such a scenario in 2015. For the majority of nations, a default, while detrimental, is survivable. However, for the United States, the issuer of the global reserve currency and the linchpin of the entire international financial framework, this represents the ultimate catastrophic measure. The entire global financial system, every pension fund, every insurance corporation, every international trade agreement, every central bank's reserves are constructed upon the fundamental presumption that United States Treasury bonds are devoid of risk. The term risk-free rate in finance directly references the yield on United States government debt. Should America default, that foundational assumption would crumble. The global banking system would collapse instantaneously. Credit markets would freeze without delay. International commerce would cease, as letters of credit would become worthless. Your credit cards would cease functioning. ATMs would cease dispensing cash. Grocery stores would be unable to replenish their stock. It would precipitate a financial cataclysm that would render 2008 a mere preliminary exercise. This is precisely why United States government bonds are held by virtually every significant global institution. China possesses over $800 billion. Japan holds in excess of $1 trillion. American pension funds, insurance providers, and financial institutions collectively hold trillions more. A default by the United States would simultaneously bankrupt the Chinese government, the Japanese government, every American retiree, and every major financial institution in the Western world. Therefore, an explicit default is also not a viable choice. This leaves only one remaining alternative, the third option. This is the path that every overextended empire throughout history has ultimately embraced when confronted with insurmountable dilemmas. From the Roman Empire's debasement of its silver denarii to the Weimar Republic in the 1920s and to post-war Britain in the 1950s, the approach is not to refuse payment of the debt. It is not to reduce expenditures. It is not to increase taxes. Instead, every single dollar, every single cent is repaid precisely on time and in full. However, it is repaid in currency that holds significantly less value than when the original obligation was incurred. The debt is effectively inflated away. The shortfall is generated through monetary expansion. The currency is debased. This is not a speculative theory. This is not conjecture. This is the established, albeit tacitly acknowledged, policy of the United States government. Here's how the financial mechanics operate and why you are the one who will bear the burden. If the government owes $36 trillion and inflation persists at a 5% annual rate, the real value of that debt diminishes by 5% each year. This is not the nominal value. The figure on paper remains constant. However, the purchasing power of that debt, its actual representation in terms of tangible goods and services, shrinks by 5% annually. In terms of purchasing power, the government has effectively eliminated $1.8 trillion of debt within a single year, without enacting any new taxes, without curtailing any programs, and without requiring any congressional vote. The bondholders received their reimbursement. They received their dollars, the exact quantity of dollars they were promised. However, those dollars now command 5% less in terms of groceries, 5% less gasoline, 5% less housing, and 5% less healthcare. Over a period of 10 years, with a consistent 5% inflation rate, the real value of the debt is reduced by nearly half. $36 trillion effectively becomes worth approximately $22 trillion in today's purchasing power. The government has just caused $14 trillion to disappear, and you have effectively paid for it with every trip you've made to the grocery store. This phenomenon is termed financial repression. It is a deliberate strategy of maintaining interest rates below the prevailing rate of inflation. The objective is to facilitate a transfer of wealth from those who save and lend to those who borrow and spend. And the most significant borrower in the history of the world is, unequivocally, the United States government. For a span of 40 years, from 1980 to 2020, the Federal Reserve functioned as the principal architect of American economic policy. When inflation escalated beyond acceptable levels, the Federal Reserve would elevate interest rates to counteract it. This action was taken even if it necessitated triggering an economic recession, even if it led to heightened unemployment, and even if it resulted in public disapproval. Paul Volcker, who served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987, implemented precisely this approach. He raised interest rates to 20%, deliberately precipitating a severe recession to combat the inflation that was undermining the dollar throughout the 1970s. Unemployment surged to 10%, the economy contracted. Volcker was publicly vilified, even facing death threats, yet he persevered because his mandate was to safeguard the currency, not to appease political figures. However, in the present day, the Federal Reserve is no longer capable of executing such measures. The magnitude of the national debt is simply too immense. The financial dynamics have fundamentally shifted. Were interest rates to revert to 10%, a level observed in the early 1980s, the annual interest payments on a debt of $36 trillion would amount to $3.6 trillion. The federal government currently collects approximately $2.4 trillion annually from individual income taxes. At a 10% interest rate, the interest payment alone would exceed the entirety of the individual income tax revenue. The government would face mathematical insolvency. Social security payments would fail to be disbursed. Military salaries would cease. Consequently, the Federal Reserve finds itself in a precarious position. It is compelled to maintain interest rates below the rate of inflation. It is obligated to tolerate inflation rates of 4%, 5%, or even 6%, as the alternative is immediate governmental bankruptcy. This situation is characterized as fiscal dominance. For the first time in contemporary American history, the Treasury Department now dictates policy, with the Federal Reserve acting as its subordinate. The autonomy of the central bank, a pillar that has preserved the dollar's integrity for over a century, is disintegrating in real time. We are not venturing into uncharted territory. We are effectively reenacting a strategy that the United States has previously employed. In 1945, following the conclusion of World War II, the United States debt to GDP ratio reached 119%. The government's indebtedness was at an all-time historical high. However, this debt was not retired through taxation. There was no extensive austerity program implemented, and crucially, there was no default. Instead, the debt was systematically extinguished through financial repression and inflation. For an entire decade, from 1945 to 1955, the Federal Reserve was legally mandated to cap interest rates at 2.5%. Concurrently, the average annual inflation rate exceeded 6%. Each year, bondholders experienced a loss of 3.5% in their purchasing power. This constituted a silent transfer of wealth from individual savers to the state. If you held a $10,000 government bond in 1945, you received your $10,000 back in 1955. However, that same $10,000 could only purchase what $7,000 could have bought in 1945. By 1955, the debt to GDP ratio had been halved. This reduction was not a consequence of a decrease in the absolute amount of debt, but rather because inflation had diminished the debt's relative significance to the overall economy. The debt remained on paper, but its real value had been systematically inflated away. This is the current strategy. However, this time, a more sophisticated system has been implemented, incorporating three modern mechanisms designed to obscure the financial exploitation until it is too late. Mechanism number 1. The captive purchaser. In an unfettered market, if the government's debt stands at $36 trillion and it continues to run deficits exceeding $1 trillion annually, rational investors would demand higher interest rates to compensate for the inherent risk. They would articulate their position by stating __quote _2 _. This is how markets fundamentally operate. However, the government cannot afford to offer 10% interest rates. At such a rate, the annual interest obligation alone would consume half of the federal budget. Therefore, the system has been manipulated. The free market for government debt has been systematically undermined through an intricate network of banking regulations enacted in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. These regulations bear names such as Basel III, Dodd-Frank, and the Liquidity Coverage Ratio. The government mandates that banks, insurance companies, pension funds, and money market funds must hold United States Treasury bonds, irrespective of their investment preferences. Regulators have classified United States Treasuries as high-quality liquid assets. Banks are legally obligated to maintain a specific percentage of their assets in these instruments to satisfy capital requirements. Failure to hold an adequate quantity of treasuries can result in regulatory intervention, potentially leading to their closure. Insurance companies are required to possess treasuries to collateralize policyholder liabilities. Pension funds are mandated to hold them as secure assets. The nominal yield on these bonds, whether it's a mere 3% or whether they are losing value due to inflation, becomes irrelevant. These institutions are compelled to acquire them to remain operational. This is dictated by law. This artificial demand creates significant distortions, suppressing interest rates to levels below what a truly free market would dictate. Your pension fund is not investing in government's debt because it represents a lucrative opportunity. It is investing in it because federal regulators would effectively shut down the fund if it failed to comply. You are being compelled to extend credit to a financially distressed government at negative real interest rates, utilizing your retirement savings. Mechanism number 2. The flawed barometer. If the objective is to illicitly extract funds from individuals entitled to inflation-adjusted payments, the most straightforward method is to falsify inflation data. Social Security benefits are directly correlated with the Consumer Price Index. Annually, benefits are intended to increase in alignment with the rate of inflation to safeguard retirees' financial security. Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, are bonds whose principal value is adjusted based on the CPI. If the CPI indicates 10% inflation, the government is obligated to pay bondholders 10% more. If the CPI reports 3% inflation, their compensation increases by only 3%. Consequently, the government possesses a vested interest amounting to trillions of dollars in minimizing the reported CPI figure. Since the 1980s, the methodology employed to calculate the CPI has undergone numerous revisions, all consistently resulting in the suppression of the official number. They introduced the concept of substitution bias. The rationale is as follows. If the price of steak increases significantly, consumers will likely shift their consumption to hamburger. Therefore, the index will measure the price of hamburger instead. This leads to the conclusion that the cost of living has not risen as substantially. However, here lies the deception. Your standard of living has actually declined. You are now consuming hamburger instead of steak, resulting in a diminished quality of life. Yet, the CPI maintains that all is stable. They have also incorporated hedonic adjustments. For instance, if a new automobile is priced $10,000 higher but features enhanced safety capabilities, the government posits that the price increase is not genuine because the consumer is receiving greater value. They consequently adjust the price increase downward or eliminate it entirely. This principle is applied across a broad spectrum of goods and services. Your mobile phone may increase in price, but with an improved camera, thus no reported inflation. Your health insurance premiums may rise, but with expanded coverage, again no reported inflation. Furthermore, they have altered the method of measuring housing expenses. Instead of directly assessing home prices or rental rates, they employ a metric known as owner's equivalent rent, an estimation derived from surveys. This approach consistently understates the actual cost of housing. If inflation were calculated using the same methodology as in 1980, employing the original framework, the official CPI figure today would be double the government's reported number. The government is deliberately misleading the public about the escalating cost of essential living expenses to protect its fiscal position. Mechanism number 3. The monetary printing press. When international entities such as China and Japan, which have historically been the primary purchasers of United States debt for extended periods, cease their acquisition or begin divesting their holdings, as they have been doing since 2022, an alternative buyer must emerge. Otherwise, interest rates would skyrocket, leading to governmental bankruptcy. In this scenario, the Federal Reserve steps in as the ultimate purchaser. The Fed generates money, creating it ex nihilo through mere digital keystrokes, and utilizes this newly created currency to acquire treasury bonds. This process is known as quantitative easing, QE. The government issues a bond, and the Fed subsequently purchases that bond with funds that did not exist mere moments prior. The government receives capital for expenditure, and the Fed obtains an IOU. This effectively expands the money supply by hundreds of billions, and at times trillions of dollars through the acquisition of government debt. The Federal Reserve artificially suppresses bond yields, thereby maintaining the government's borrowing costs at artificially low levels. If the Federal Reserve were not to intervene, yields would surge to 8%, 10%, or potentially even higher. However, this infusion of newly printed money floods the financial system with an increased quantity of dollars, and as the supply of any commodity expands, its intrinsic value diminishes. The stock market experiences an upward trend not because corporations are demonstrating enhanced profitability, but because a greater volume of dollars is competing for the same number of shares. Real estate values escalate not due to an expansion in housing availability, but because more dollars are chasing a finite number of properties. This phenomenon is referred to as the everything bubble. Your 401k retirement account may appear larger and your home may be valued more highly on paper, fostering a sense of increased wealth. However, this is not a reflection of genuine wealth augmentation. It simply means you possess a greater number of dollars, and those dollars possess diminished purchasing power. The government is effectively discharging its debt by devaluing every dollar you own. This includes every dollar residing in your bank account, every dollar you receive in your paycheck, and every dollar held within your retirement portfolio. This process is not impacting all segments of society equally. In fact, it is the primary catalyst for the wealth disparity that is fracturing the nation. There exists an economic concept that elucidates this phenomenon with remarkable precision, the Cantillon effect. Named after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century economist, it describes how the initial recipients of newly created money benefit disproportionately. When the Federal Reserve injects $1 trillion into the economy, these funds are not disseminated randomly to the general populace. Instead, they are introduced into the financial system at its apex. The Fed acquires bonds from prominent financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and BlackRock. These entities receive the new capital first, often at negligible interest rates, before it permeates the broader economy and before prices have had an opportunity to adjust. What do these institutions do with this virtually cost-free capital? They invest it. They acquire assets such as stocks, real estate, and commodities, anything perceived as scarce. By the time this newly created money eventually trickles down to the average worker in the form of wages, prices for essential goods and services have already experienced an upward revision. The cost of rent has already escalated. The cost of food has already increased. The affluent have acquired the new money when prices were still relatively low, while the less affluent receive it only after prices have already risen substantially. This is the reason why, since 2008, coinciding with the Federal Reserve's commencement of large-scale money printing, we have witnessed what economists term a K-shaped economy. The top 10% of the population, those who own assets such as stocks, real estate, and businesses, have experienced an exponential surge in their wealth. The stock market has appreciated by 400%. Real estate values in major metropolitan areas have doubled or even tripled. The net worth of American billionaires has expanded from $1.3 trillion in 2008 to over $5 trillion today. In stark contrast, the bottom 90% of the population, those who are primarily reliant on wages, have witnessed a precipitous decline in their purchasing power. Real wages, adjusted for actual inflation, have remained stagnant or have declined over the past 40 years. The costs of housing, education, and healthcare have vastly outpaced wage growth. A dwelling that once cost 3 times the median salary in 1980 now demands 8 times the median salary. The national debt is being liquidated by systematically diminishing the economic standing of the American middle class. For 4 decades, the standard financial guidance in America was straightforward. Exert diligent effort, save 10% of your income, deposit it into a bank savings account, and invest in government bonds. The traditional 640 portfolio, comprising 60% stocks and 40% bonds, was considered a secure and stable approach that yielded reliable results, enabling individuals to retire with dignity. However, in the current environment of financial repression, this advice has evolved into financial self-sabotage. If you opt to save in cash or maintain your funds in a savings account earning 1 or 2% interest, while real inflation is hovering around 6 or 8%, you are effectively losing 5 or 6% of your purchasing power each year. Over a decade, this translates to a 50% erosion of your wealth. If you invest in government bonds yielding 4% with real inflation at 6%, you are experiencing a 2% annual loss in real terms. In essence, you are paying the government to safeguard your money. We are entering an era characterized by mandated speculation. Merely to preserve one's wealth, not to augment it, but simply to maintain purchasing power, individuals are now compelled to assume significant risks. This necessitates investing in stocks despite valuations reaching historic highs. It requires purchasing real estate even when prices are prohibitively expensive. It involves acquiring cryptocurrencies, gold, commodities, or any asset that is inherently scarce and beyond the government's capacity to artificially inflate. The sole purpose is to outpace the debasement of the currency. The government has effectively transformed the entire economy into a gambling arena where participation is mandatory merely to achieve a break-even outcome. This is because the ostensibly safe option of saving money in a bank is being deliberately undermined through deliberate policy. However, there exists one additional instrument that has not yet been fully deployed. This represents the ultimate objective, and it is presently being constructed within the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, and central banks globally. This is the advent of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, colloquially referred to as the digital dollar. Currently, the government's capacity to manipulate your finances is constrained by a single critical factor: physical cash. Should the government implement negative interest rates or attempt to levy charges on your deposited savings, you possess an escape route. You can withdraw your cash and store it securely at your residence, perhaps under your mattress or in a safe. You can exit the conventional banking system. Physical currency is anonymous and untraceable. This inherent characteristic renders it the ultimate check on governmental authority. However, a central bank digital currency effectively eliminates this recourse. If the dollar transitions to a purely digital form, with every unit existing solely as an entry within a Federal Reserve database, and if physical cash is abolished, the government would attain absolute control over your financial assets. Consider the implications. They could instantly implement negative interest rates. They could program your digital wallet to deduct 1% from your balance on a monthly basis, thereby coercing you to spend. They could impose expiration dates on currency. Your stimulus check, for example, might be rendered invalid if not utilized within 30 days. With a mere keystroke, they possess the ability to freeze your financial resources if you are perceived as a threat, if you contribute to an unfavorable cause, or if you participate in demonstrations. This can occur without any judicial authorization or a formal legal process. They can meticulously track every financial movement you make, including your shopping habits, your purchases, and the recipients of your payments, establishing a comprehensive system of financial oversight. This system could mirror the social credit scoring implemented in China, where a low score could prevent you from purchasing airfare or obtaining loans. Furthermore, they could impose restrictions on capital flow, limiting the amounts you're permitted to spend, prohibiting the purchase of precious metals, and preventing the transfer of funds beyond national borders. This is not a distant possibility or a work of fiction. It's already being piloted in China with their digital currency, the Yuan, which has undergone testing for features like expiration dates and geographic limitations. The European Central Bank is actively developing a digital euro, and the Federal Reserve has released research indicating a potential digital dollar. This digital dollar could be presented as the definitive resolution to the national debt crisis, granting the government the authority to seize assets with effortless ease. The relentless push towards a cashless society is not about enhancing convenience. It is fundamentally about consolidating control and eliminating any potential avenues of escape as wealth redistribution intensifies. The United States is currently experiencing a default on its national debt, a process that is unfolding subtly and bureaucratically, but a default nonetheless. The $36 trillion owed will never be repaid in real terms. Instead, its value will be eroded through inflation over the next 10 to 15 years. Those who will benefit from this scenario are individuals who possess tangible, scarce assets. This includes prime real estate in strategic locations, gold and silver, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin that cannot be artificially increased in supply, and profitable businesses that generate genuine cash flow, assets that are beyond the government's capacity to print. Conversely, those who place their trust in the existing currency and financial institutions and who hold their wealth in cash, savings accounts, or government bonds will likely suffer losses. The traditional American aspiration of accumulating wealth through diligent saving has become obsolete. We have now entered an era focused on asset preservation. We've discussed how governmental strategies such as inflation, stringent regulations, and digital control are being employed to effectively eliminate the national debt by devaluing individual purchasing power. However, historical precedents demonstrate that when governments face extreme desperation and when gradual methods prove insufficient, their actions become overt. They will simply alter the legal framework to appropriate what they desire. In 1933, within the United States of America, the government enacted precisely such a measure. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, an action that, with a single stroke of his pen, rendered it unlawful for American citizens to own gold. The government compelled all Americans to surrender their gold reserves at a rate of $20.67 per ounce. Failure to comply carried a penalty of a $10,000 fine and a potential sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison. Federal agents were dispatched to conduct door-to-door searches, and safety deposit boxes were raided. Following the confiscation of all gold, the government promptly revalued it to $35 per ounce, effectively confiscating 40% of the American people's wealth in a single maneuver. In the subsequent presentation, I will elaborate on the complete narrative of the 1933 gold confiscation, including clandestine prosecutions, the legal loopholes exploited by the affluent to evade repercussions, and the alarming legal precedent that persists today, empowering the president to seize your gold, your Bitcoin, and even your retirement accounts during periods of national emergency. It is imperative for you to understand whether your assets are truly secure. Please ensure you subscribe and enable notifications. I look forward to our next discussion.